Hey folks, John here, Altigraphy Forge. Welcome back. So if you saw my most recent video where we rebuilt the foundry furnace to get hot enough to make Crucible steel, well, that's what's going on today, so stick around. If you don't know what Crucible steel is, there's going to be a couple of links in the description you should check out. Niels Provost, who's a very talented and skilled smith I follow, he did a whole series on recreating Wootz steel. Wootz is just another name for Crucible steel. Man-at-Arms actually did it in their Ulfbert Viking sword video. Fun fact, the legendary Ulfbert Viking swords, only a handful of which have been found, were made of Crucible steel. But basically what it is ultra-high carbon blade steel that's produced in a clay graphite crucible. Originally it came from India, Sri Lanka, the Middle East, places like that, and it was imported into Europe. And I think the earliest Crucible steel blades they found they've dated around 400 AD. And this was back during a time when most weaponry was made of soft wrought iron. So, you know, hard, tough, sharp steel was thought to be magic, and a Crucible steel sword would cost the equivalent of a small castle back in those days. But what we got to get started, roughly 2,000 grams of wrought iron from an old wagon tire I cut up and flattened out. We're going to grind all this rust and scale and crop off just so we got clean material to go in the Crucible. We don't want any gaseous reactions that we aren't making happening in there and possibly contaminating the charge. My carbon source is going to be crushed up charcoal. I'm going to add 30 grams, which in theory should give us a carbon content of around 1.5%, which as a point of reference, 1095, a common blade steel, has about 1%. But if you add too much, you end up with cast iron, which is 2% or over, which is unusable. So we'll get this cleaned off and we'll see what happens. So, after cutting my wrought iron down into more manageable chunks so it fits in the Crucible easier and grinding it clean, we lost a little bit of mass. Now we've got 1,500 grams instead of the 2,000 we had before. So all that does is changes how much charcoal we're going to put in. Instead of 30 grams, we're going to put in 23 grams, and that should give us about the same 1.5% carbon content we're going for. So let's measure out 23 grams of charcoal powder. Oop. Perfect. All right, let's throw our charcoal in there. I'm going to throw some borax in here for good measure. And for our main flux to protect the charge, we got pieces of my Love Life here. This will melt and form a protective barrier over everything inside the Crucible, hopefully keep any oxygen from getting to it. So, we're just going to fill the Crucible the rest of the way up with that. Let's break that piece a little more. So, last step in getting this thing ready, we're just taking some Satanite refractory mortar and we're kind of building a cap on the Crucible. This will help keep the oxygen out, obviously, as well as keep the charcoal powder, that's our carbon source, from just burning. So, that's all that's going on now. Now to do it, really. So there we have it. We'll let this guy set up overnight and it'll be ready to fire. Doesn't look like much now, but hopefully we got some ultra-high carbon blade steel in there. So here we go. I got the furnace preheating. Got my Crucible right there ready to go. I got the gas tank suspended in the slack tub to keep it from freezing up. We'll let this thing come up to temp and we'll get started. Just about ready to put our Crucible in. I got my pseudo apprentice Dale in here to help me. Go ahead and cut the gas off. Good. Alrighty, nice and easy. Alright, gas on. So we got our Crucible in there. It's starting to glow orange. It'll probably take a while for all that to come up to melting temperature. Once it's white hot to where we can't see inside anymore, we're going to cook the charge for 2 hours, and hopefully that should give us enough time for everything in there to be completely liquid. So we're at the point we can no longer see into the furnace, so we're going to start the timer, and we're going to cook this charge for 2 hours, then pull it out of there and see what we got. Alright, well, we're going to cook this thing for 2 hours, but it's been 90 minutes, and we're getting kind of impatient. So we're going to go ahead and cut the furnace and see what we got. We're going to cut the gas. Ooh. What do we got here? can't get close to it to get the crucible out. Okay, yeah, it did. Damn it, it did. So, we might have cooked it a little bit too long. As you can see, our crucible actually ruptured. But we definitely know the steel melted, so we're going to let that cool and see what we got. So, we've definitely got some solid matter up there, but as you can see, our crucible didn't really make it. So, 90 minutes might have been just a little too long. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have made crucible steel. I don't know how usable this ingot's going to be because of all these air bubbles in there. We're going to see how... We're going to cut it open once it cools down and see how it looks on the inside. But, we definitely got steel. First thing we're going to do is we're going to spark test this to get a rough idea of how much carbon's in it. First thing, I'll show you mild steel, and then I'll show you 1075. The more carbon a steel has, the shorter and more bursty the sparks are going to be. I'm going to spark test it down here, where I feel like we're most likely to have good steel, as well as up here in this horrible mess of crap we got. And we'll see what we got. You see, there appears to be a lot of air bubbles trapped in the ingot. What I'm going to try to do is basically forge weld this into a solid bar like you would if you were refining bloom steel. I don't know how well that's going to work, but it's the only way I can think of to get past this. And this is mostly just an experiment anyway, so I'm going to see how it goes. So, I don't know if what I'm doing is even possible, but my theory is that if I forge this thing down with welding heats, I should be able to consolidate it into a usable piece of material. But like I said, I don't know if that's how that's going to work in practicality. The ingot is staying together, which is good, but this is just such a big piece of steel to work down by hand, and there's no good way to hold on to it. I think a better option is just going to be to cut it in half and take the bottom where the steel looks a little bit better and try forging that out. So I ended up having to weld a handle on this thing, which is something I don't normally do, but there was just no other way to hold it. It's forging, but very difficultly so. It's like I'll work it a little bit, forge weld one, crack shut, another one will form. It is moving, but at this point I'm not confident in the structural integrity of this material. The cracks, if not all of them, welded shut. And now I'm just trying to draw this thing out into kind of a bar stock so I can etch it and see what the pattern looks like. I tell you, this stuff's tough though. Like even, you know, up at welding heat, it's not moving very much under the hammer. So, this is approximately 1/4 of the ingot forged out into a bar. A little bit of splitting on the end, but I'm going to cut that off as well as the end I welded the handle onto. And then we'll grind this thing smooth and etch it and see what the pattern looks like. I just wanted to show you while that's in the etch. The inside of the furnace is freaking mangled. You know, there's molten glass all over from where the crucible ruptured, and pieces of the crucible are stuck in there. So, more experimentation is definitely required. So the pattern in the steel is really, really subtle and kind of hard to capture on camera. That's why I'm showing you out here instead of in the shop. But, yeah, it's kind of got that greeny Woots-like pattern to it. Well, folks, there you go. Backyard crucible steel. I honestly don't know whether to chalk this project up as a success or a failure because a lot of things went wrong. From the crucible rupturing, I guess we weren't controlling the temperature in the furnace very well, and I think we cooked the charge too long. When we pulled it out of the furnace, it cooled down too fast. That's why I think so much air ended up contaminating the charge, and why I don't know how much of that billet I'm actually going to be able to salvage and get usable material out of. So in the literal sense of the word, we did make crucible steel. We did succeed in melting down wrought iron and imbuing it with more carbon. So I'd call it a mixed success. This is a piece, an offcut off the end of this bar that I'll oil quench just to see if it would harden. And it did harden really well, actually, so we did succeed in making a hardenable steel. So, like I said, I'll call it a mixed success. I did learn a lot that's going to be really useful later on when I attempt to do this again. I'll probably add in some 01 steel or some W2 for a source of chromium and vanadium that'll make for a more interesting pattern. This was a pretty simple mix of just wrought iron and charcoal powder. But there we go. It's been a long process. Been a long day. I'm tired. So I'm going to go ahead and call it for this video. If you like what you saw, like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. Always more cool stuff coming. Links to the Etsy and the Patreon if you want to help support the channel. And y'all take care.